At that time, he was in such a mood, saying that he no longer wanted to paint violent paintings. He felt tired of them, having been involved in so many of them. He said, "I'm 94 years old." Clint Eastwood finally spoke up, tearing down the veil of secrecy that had shrouded Gene Hackman for over half a century. The friend, the rival, and the most haunting ghost in his life. Every word Clint spoke cut through memories like a blunt knife, dragging out broken phone calls, unspoken words, almost like backstage punches exchanged after Unforgiven. And because of some secrets about Gene Hackman, if they weren't told, Clint would take them to the grave. What is that truth? If you want to know, leave a comment with the number 1. This is both a story of friendship and the tragedy of cowboys who never learned how to bow their heads, of Clint and Gene, 2 men born to face each other through the barrel of a gun until the end of their lives. Clint Eastwood sat silently, lost in thought by the living room window, his weathered hand gently resting on the worn wooden armrest. The sunset cast long shadows through the glass, washing a pale hue over the old photographs on the wall. At 94, each passing day felt like a fragile sheet of paper, ready to be torn apart by the winds of memory. But today, the wind carried not the scent of gunpowder from the Wild West or the rustle of a new script. Today there was only silence, and this silence was named Gene Hackman. Clint Eastwood had lived with silence like an old, stern friend. Those who knew him understood that Clint was not one to dwell in the past, let alone cling to old glories. But this silence was different from anything he had ever known. It was heavy, like the click of a gun with no bullets left, like the final step on barren land. For the man who had passed was Little Bill Daggett. Clint and Gene were not the type of friends who called each other every day or met up on weekends. They were the kind of friends from an old generation, men who communicated through glances, nods, and brief exchanges between scenes. Unforgiven was not just an Oscar-winning film. It was a thread that bound the 2 Western souls together. Throughout Hollywood history, countless pairs of colleagues have turned into enemies, but Clint and Gene never allowed awards or stage lights to overshadow the respect they had for each other. When Unforgiven was released in 1992, Clint was 62, and Gene was also 62. The 2 aged souls stepped out of the shadow of a golden era to tell their own story, that of the old heroes, survivors of too many confrontations, too many stray bullets. Killing a man is a hard thing. William Money's line rang out like a death knell, haunting those who had worn the cowboy hat in real life. From that moment on, Clint and Gene understood that the bond between them had been tightened, inseparable. But time shows no mercy to anyone. In the following years, Clint continued his relentless work in filmmaking, while Gene disappeared without a formal farewell, no retirement party, no emotional speech. Gene Hackman, the tireless cop Popeye Doyle, the man who once shook America to its core, suddenly vanished from Hollywood's radar as if he had never existed. Clint called a few times, then stopped. He understood that sometimes old cowboys choose to quietly fade into the darkness, like the final bullet falling to the floor. Each time Gene's name was mentioned, Clint's gaze grew somber. "He was one of the best," he said, then fell silent. No one knew what they had said to each other after their last meeting. All anyone saw was that whenever Unforgiven was brought up, Clint would retreat into his private room, sit quietly beside his old guitar, and softly pluck a few notes. Once, when asked if he kept in touch with Gene, Clint simply smiled and replied, "We had our time." But what was the truth? No one knew. Clint was not one to easily share, and Gene even less so. Both carried the weight of lost cowboys in a digital age. They were symbols of an era when men settled everything with guns and silence. But Gene's departure, with all its strangeness and mystery, forced Clint to break that rule of never sharing. In 2015, a handwritten letter with no return address, only 3 faint, swaying letters in the top left corner, GH, appeared in the old wooden mailbox at Clint Eastwood's home in Carmel. The letter was found by Dina, his ex-wife, who still occasionally visited to look after the house when Clint was away. She placed it on his desk, beside a pile of dusty scripts, then quietly left without saying a word. She knew that letter was more important than any $1-million script, because it came from Gene Hackman, the old friend who had haunted Clint even after they no longer stood together under the bright lights of the set. Inside the envelope was a yellowed piece of paper with shaky, slanted handwriting, yet still sharp in the way of a man who had held countless golden statues. There were no greetings, no long introductions. Gene went straight to the point, as he always did when facing anything in life. One final journey. Clint, it's just you and me. No Oscars, no press, no agents, just us and a story only we can tell. Clint read that letter over and over until its edges became creased and yellowed with time, but he never replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because Clint knew that some journeys are meant to be dreamed, not lived. The relationship between Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman didn't begin on the set of Unforgiven. In fact, they first met in the 1970s, when Clint was struggling to escape the shadow of Dirty Harry, and Gene had just won an Oscar for The French Connection. Their brief encounter at a producer's party left no significant impression. Clint stood quietly in a corner of the room, his whiskey glass gently swirling in his hand, while Gene laughed loudly, the self-satisfied look of a recent winner in his eyes. They were two contrasting pieces, one as quiet as a cold gun, the other as fiery as a matchstick burning bright. Then, in 1992, Unforgiven brought them together. There was no fanfare, no trumpets, just 2 old cowboys sharing one last cigarette before the sunset. Clint never forgot the look on Gene's face after the final scene, when William Money turned his back and walked away in the rain. Gene watched him. No acting, no dialogue, just the honest gaze of a man who knew his time was running out. From that look, an invisible thread connected them. After Unforgiven, they didn't meet often anymore. Meals became rare, calls spaced out over many years. But the handwritten letters never stopped. Gene didn't use email, and Clint didn't like texting. Both believed that only handwritten words carried the full weight of things they couldn't say out loud. In those letters, there were jokes about Hollywood becoming ever more tawdry, memories of filming in the cold, and confessions that could only be made when sitting alone at a writing desk. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we made one last movie? Gene had written once, and Clint read it, folded it, placed it in a drawer, and went outside to light a cigar. He didn't reply, not because there was no answer, but because the question itself was enough. They both knew the shadow of Unforgiven was too large, so large that anything they did afterward would only be a faint shadow beside it. But in 2015, Gene wrote again, without hint, without hesitation. This time, he sent a direct invitation. "There's a story we haven't told, Clint. The story of two men who should have died long ago but somehow survived and continue to write. Tell it before it's too late." Clint held that letter in his hand for a long time. In his mind, the scenes began to play on their own. Two old cowboys, hunched backs, trembling hands, facing each other on a dusty street. No guns, only words left unsaid. But Clint knew Gene wasn't just inviting him to make a movie. He was inviting Clint on one final journey, a journey of two old souls who had survived every storm a film could bring, but not the storm of friendship. In 2018, at a corner table in a small seaside bar in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat across from his longtime agent, a thick stack of scripts in front of him. These were not the usual Hollywood scripts he received every week. This was a special project, one proposed by a special person, Gene Hackman. It all started a few months earlier, when Gene, who had nearly withdrawn from public life after his last film, Welcome to Mooseport in 2004, unexpectedly called Clint. Gene's voice now was deeper than before. The loud laughter and familiar sarcastic remarks were gone, replaced by a slow deliberation as if each word was carefully considered before being spoken. "Clint, I've got something. Maybe my last film. I don't know how much time I have left, but if there's one last film, I only want to make it with you." Clint remained silent for a long while on the other end of the line. They say that when old gunslingers talk about their final stand, it means the guns are loaded, but no one knows where the bullet will land. That film was never announced. No title, no producer, not even a formal contract. Only the initial idea handwritten on a crumpled piece of paper. Two old cowboys, once comrades, now facing each other at opposite ends of a town, each carrying a secret that cannot be revealed. A gunfight no one wants, but one that cannot be avoided. Clint liked the idea, and Gene liked it too, but that was the last point on which they agreed. The project stretched through countless arguments. Clint wanted the film to be nostalgic, a peaceful farewell to their golden era, while Gene wanted it to be cold, brutal, exposing the dark side of legends. No glory, only scars festering beneath wrinkled skin. They argued through handwritten letters, then over the phone. The letters that had once connected them now became sharp weapons. Gene accused Clint of being afraid to tarnish his own monument, while Clint mocked Gene for trying to hold on to a fading light. Word by word, sentence by sentence, they pushed each other further apart. The climax came in a private meeting between the two at the end of 2018 in Santa Fe. No assistants, no producers, just the two men who had once stood side by side, now facing each other in a dimly lit room. No one knew exactly what was said in that room, but according to a hotel employee who overheard, it was Gene who stormed out first, kicking the door open so forcefully that a painting on the wall shook. Clint stayed behind, staring at the whiskey glass in front of him, never taking a sip. In 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when everything seemed to be at a standstill, Gene suddenly called Clint. It was their first call after more than 2 years of silence. No one knew who called first, but both understood this might be the last time. They were silent for a long while after the initial greeting. Gene asked about Clint's health. Clint gave a brief reply. They talked about the weather, gas prices, the old films they had both been part of, but neither of them mentioned the unfinished film from 2018. Suddenly, Gene paused, his voice soft, as if speaking to himself. "Clint, do you remember the last scene of Unforgiven, when I stood there watching you ride off into the rain?" Clint remained silent. Gene chuckled lightly. "I never said it, but I knew we'd never have another one." Clint wanted to say something, but his throat tightened. The call ended with a sigh from both ends. They didn't hang up immediately, leaving it there, listening to each other's breath, as if two old cowboys stood at opposite ends of a town, hands on the gun, but no one drawing. After that call, Clint told a close friend, "I don't think I'll talk to Gene again," and he was right. When the news of Gene's passing spread in 2023, Clint made no public statement, posted no tribute. He simply withdrew to his ranch, opening an old drawer where he kept all the letters Gene had sent, from the youthful ones to the final trembling words. Clint read through them all, each word, each punctuation mark, as if trying to uncover any secret Gene had left unsaid. He found no secrets, only empty spaces, unfinished sentences, words crossed out, letters never sent. The greatest secret of Gene Hackman wasn't in those lines, but in the prolonged silence between them, a bullet that had slipped between two old friends, never falling. And Clint understood that a part of his soul had gone with Gene down that dusty road long ago. When the news of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa's death was discovered in their small home in Santa Fe, it wasn't a shock to Clint Eastwood. At 94, Clint understood that quiet departures in the night were no longer unusual. What left him motionless by the window of his Carmel ranch that morning was not the news of Gene's death, but the confirmation that the final words that should have been said would now never be spoken. The press quickly surrounded him, searching everywhere for a statement from Clint. For the past 2 years, Clint and Gene had been like ghosts, never meeting, never mentioning each other's names, not even sending a single message since their last phone call in 2021, when silence had filled more of the space than words. Every bridge had collapsed. But that afternoon, Clint broke the silence, not through his representative, not with a cold statement, but standing before the camera of a local newspaper. His voice was hoarse from age and the years of silence he had imposed on himself. There was no actor better than Gene Hackman, and there was no friend more important to me than him. Just 2 sentences, no embellishment, no exaggeration. But for those who had followed the two old cowboys for decades, they understood that Clint Eastwood had never spoken such words about anyone. Not about Sergio Leone, not about Lee Van Cleef, not about his first wife, only Gene Hackman. The reporters thought that was all. But no. After that brief statement, Clint drove back to his farm, shut the door, and severed all communication. The landline, the cell phone, the old fax machine, all were silent like a desert after a gunfight. Only one call was made, to Kyle Eastwood, Clint's eldest son, who understood more than anyone the strange but deep relationship between his father and Gene Hackman. According to Kyle's account to a close friend, Clint's voice that day was different, softer, but weighed down. The voice of the man with no name was gone, replaced by the voice of an old man, finally admitting that he had lost the battle with himself. "We wasted too much time being stubborn old men," just one sentence with no explanation, no justification, but in those words was all the regret, self-deprecation, and emotion. Gene Hackman was not just a co-star, not just a partner in cinematic battles. He was the only mirror that reflected a rough, flawed, and vulnerable Clint Eastwood behind the cold exterior of a cowboy. And Clint knew that he was also the only mirror in which Gene Hackman dared to look at himself. The two stubborn old men, as Clint had called them, had spent nearly 50 years doing everything except admitting how much they needed each other. They shared letters, stories, unfinished dreams. They argued, slammed phones, joined in ridiculous drinking sessions that lasted for hours. But they never said that when the final day came, the most painful part wasn't losing a friend, but realizing they had pushed that friend too far away, beyond the point of no return. And then, when the dust settled, Clint sat there, alone on the porch, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. No cigarette, no whiskey, just the sound of the wind howling through the old wooden planks. Those close to him know that Clint Eastwood is not a man who easily cries. But on that day, Kyle said that his eyes were red, tears that never fell but silently wore away the sharp edges of an old cowboy's soul. Clint had survived countless gunfights on screen, but his final battle with his own stubbornness was the bitterest defeat. The press continued to speculate, digging into whether there was a joint will between Clint and Gene, if there was a secret agreement about the unfinished movie from 2018, or if there was a final letter that Clint never sent. No one knows except Clint, and he will never tell. Do you know about that letter? If so, leave comment number 2. If not, leave number 5. All the world saw was an old, frail man, sitting quietly at the dinner table, fiddling with an old lighter, a birthday gift Gene had given him in 1985 after Pale Rider was released, engraved with only 2 words, compadre. Not friend, not brother, just compadre, a companion, a gunslinger ready to stand by your side but also ready to draw when needed. As the sunset fell on the Carmel Ranch, Clint's shadow stretched across the wooden floor, blending with the sound of the waves crashing. Life went on as it always had, but somewhere in the fading light, perhaps Gene Hackman still stood there, squinting at his old friend. Just like in the old days, when they stood at opposite ends of the town. No words spoken, no shots fired, just 2 old souls finally learning to let go. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa's passing on a quiet afternoon in Santa Fe spread through Hollywood like a cold breeze. There was no fanfare, no public outpouring, entirely fitting with the quiet lifestyle he had led in the final 20 years of his life. But as the breeze settled, it left behind a vast emptiness, not only in the history of cinema, but also in the hearts of those who had stood beside Gene under the spotlight. Hollywood awoke to the staggering realization that a monument had silently ridden into the sunset. Tributes began to pour in like a quiet rain, persistent but soft, from the young faces who had never met Gene in person to the seasoned veterans who saw him as the standard of acting. All of them shared heartfelt words, tributes for the rough but incredibly talented cowboy. Morgan Freeman, who had stood beside Gene in Unforgiven, shared a black and white photo from 1992 showing the three men, Clint, Gene, and Morgan, sitting together on a wooden porch, each with a cigarette in hand, staring into the distance. Gene was the only one who could make Clint Eastwood lose his patience on set, but Clint was also the only one who could make Gene Hackman laugh with a dry joke. They were like oil and water, unable to live without each other, but the most anticipated voice, of course, was Clint Eastwood's. Clint didn't write much. He only sent a single handwritten letter through his manager to The Hollywood Reporter. The letter was brief, but each sentence seemed to encapsulate half a century of ups and downs between the two cowboys. Gene Hackman and I were never close friends, at least not by Hollywood's definition. We didn't text each other. We didn't invite each other to birthday parties. We argued more than we laughed. We were silent more than we spoke. But if anyone were to ask me at the end of my gun who I'd most want to see, the answer has always been Gene Hackman. Just 4 sentences, but the entire Hollywood world was stunned. That statement for the American film industry was almost a legendary vow, because if Clint Eastwood was the last surviving figure from the Golden Cowboy era, Gene Hackman was the only one brave enough to stand beside him, unafraid, unyielding, neither enemy nor entirely an ally, but the one person Clint believed deserved his final bullet. The story of Unforgiven is the one most often recalled. The brutal, grim Western, where Clint and Gene first pointed their guns at each other both on-screen and off. The media has retold behind-the-scenes stories, like when Gene Hackman got angry when Clint changed lines on set, or when Clint quietly walked out of a meeting because Gene made a remark that touched his director's ego. But at the end of the day, they always found their way back to each other. Old photos flood social media, showing Clint and Gene standing in the cold rain in Alberta, their dusty coats, eyes squinting against the wind, the two men not smiling, not posing, just standing there as if nothing in the world mattered except the person standing next to them. Hollywood loves flashy stories, but the story of Clint and Gene is filled with rough edges, no perfect friendship, no nights spent sharing beers, just awkward handshakes after every argument, short handwritten letters holding thousands of unsaid words. And perhaps it's that imperfect friendship that made Hollywood respect them more than any polished one. We don't have to like each other to know we need each other. Clint's words from 2004 suddenly went viral, shared across film forums. Gene Hackman had passed away, taking with him the untold secrets of his life, but Clint Eastwood remains, a lone gunslinger standing on the hilltop, gazing down at the valley of the past. Now, no one is at the other end of the barrel to bother Clint, to argue over every scene, to quietly sit beside him after long days of shooting. No one understood Clint Eastwood like Gene Hackman did. Hollywood remembers Gene Hackman as a cinematic icon, but to Clint, Gene wasn't just a legend. He was the only one brave enough to call Clint a stubborn old man and then burst into laughter, the only one bold enough to throw a script in Clint's face, pick it up, revise it, and say, "Make it right." And when the night falls, amidst the dim yellow lights of a roadside bar, perhaps somewhere in the Hollywood sky, 2 cowboy ghosts are riding side by side down a dusty road, saying nothing, needing no words, just 2 old men finally riding together as they were meant to. In January 2024, As winter blanketed Carmel by the sea in a layer of white snow, Clint Eastwood sat at an old wooden table by the window, his calloused fingers gripping the fountain pen that had been his companion for decades. In front of him lay a blank sheet of paper, still and silent, as if awaiting one final confession. Clint was not a man given to apologies, let alone explanations, but he wrote slowly, each stroke of the pen trembling as if each word carried the weight of a heavy past. This letter was for Gene Hackman, the friend, the rival, the only person Clint Eastwood both wanted to avoid and yet desperately longed to see again in the world. Gene, I guess we both thought we had more time. Turns out all we really have is Unforgiven. These short, harsh words were as much a reflection of Clint himself, yet behind the black ink was a lifetime of highs and lows between two old cowboys, debates over every frame, long silent phone calls, those glances that understood each other's breath without either ever admitting it. Clint folded the letter, placing it in a faded brown envelope, but he never sent it. The letter remained in an old wooden box in the corner of the room, alongside unwritten scripts, blurry behind-the-scenes photos, and untold memories of Gene Hackman. The box stood like a wordless diary, a place where all that Clint had left unsaid was buried. When his family found it after Gene Hackman and his wife passed away, the letter was still intact, unsealed, never having left that room. An unsent letter, but one that no longer mattered, for the recipient had understood long ago. Some friendships don't need a perfect ending. Some apologies don't need to be spoken, and some cowboys are born to stand at opposite ends of the town, not moving forward, not turning away, just quietly waiting for each other as the sun sets. That evening, Clint sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the fiery horizon. The shadows grew longer, slowly enveloping his frail figure. An old gunslinger who had finally come to understand that all the grudges, stubbornness, and pride between him and Gene Hackman didn't really matter. All that remained were the whispers of the wind, carrying the sound of distant hooves, where the two old gunslingers would finally ride together on a road no longer divided. The letter remained in the old box, a final secret between the two men, and Clint Eastwood, the last gunslinger, whispered into the darkness, "I'll see you again, Gene, when the storm settles." Two old gunslingers, one fallen, one standing tall, left only with unsaid words, unsent letters, and rusted guns lying still under the dust of time. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to support our channel.